Hi, gang. Welcome back. And we're going to start with Amos, a little deeper into Amos than what we did. Now, remember, the lecture previous to this one is just kind of setting you up and using Amos as some examples. And now we're going to kind of see some of that stuff go into play a little deeper into the text. So let's get started with Amos. So we're calling this helpfully Amos Part 2. All right. So just a kind of review, remember that Amos is a set of oracles of the prophet, and he's addressing the situations of the northern kingdom. So this is Israel. Remember, you've got the northern kingdom, we have the 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom, we have 2. The northern kingdom is known as Israel, the southern kingdom is known as Judah. And the primary message or the upshot of Amos is that all the sins and all the moral failings of Israel will be punished by Yahweh on a national level, right? So when the northern kingdom fell, it's understood to be a fulfillment of Amos's prophecy. And remember too, we talked about this with the DH, and this is the idea that the prophets are going to carry forward is that this is an execution of Yahweh's punishment against the Israelites for their sins. So the Assyrians are just instruments of that, or tools of Yahweh's punishment. And it's also important to note that when Judah will later fall, Amos's prophecy is also reflected in the knowledge of this later reality through additions of a later editor. And Collins does talk about that in the section on Amos. But the main themes of book of Amos and why Amos is so important is these main themes are going to be picked up by other prophets. And so this is why it's so important we start with Amos, because those other prophets are going to build on what Amos sort of sets up here. So pay attention to some of these themes that we're looking at and how those themes are going to operate within the particular historical circumstances that each one of the prophets are facing. All right. So the first theme that we see there is the theme of social justice. Amos is characterized by the strong public and moral criticism, right? He's looking at things around him and he's going, this is a complete erosion of the community. And he gets really kind of worked up. If you remember reading through some of those materials that we looked at in the first lecture, one of the big accusations he launches at his fellow Hebrews is this sort of superficial piety. And that kind of comes out. So here, I'm telling you to pause. And I think this is a really good moment for you to do that. And look at Amos 4:3 as an example of what we're looking at. So if you've got a moment, just hit pause there on the thing and turn to your Bibles, either online. I'm doing that myself here, just like we do in class, and look at Amos chapter 4. Okay, so I'm going to pull it up, and that is not what I wanted, of course. And I love the language in Amos chapter 4 because it gets pretty pretty colorful. So looking there in verses 1-3, he says, hear this word, you cows of Bashan on Mount Samaria, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to your husbands, bring us some drinks. The sovereign Lord has sworn by his holiness, the time will surely come when you will be taken away with hooks, the last of you with fish hooks. You will each go straight out through the breaches in the wall, and you will be cast out toward Harmon, declares the Lord. I mean, the language there, right? It's pretty graphic. The cows of Bashan are these wealthy kind of women who just, consume, right? If you've ever, I've shared with you guys before, I grew up on a cattle farm. Cows are constantly consuming all day, right? And then look then about, right, he says, and you oppress the poor and crush the needy. So he's clearly, right, that there's a kind of social justice ethic that you're just constantly consuming, you're taking away from others, and it comes at the cost of other people, right? The exploitation of others. And then if you go down to Amos chapter 6, it gets even more clear kind of what he's going after here. He says, woe to you who are complacent in Zion, and to you who feel secure in Mount Samaria, you notable men of the foremost nation, to whom the people of Israel come. So he's saying, right, that it's really the problem here is wealth. Wealth has made people feel safe and secure in a false sense of power, right? And it gets really interesting when you get to Amos 8. So take your time really quickly and hop over to Amos 8 and look at verses 4 through 6. As he says here, hear this, you who trample the needy and do away with the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath be ended, that we may market wheat? Skimping on the measure, boosting the price, and cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor with silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling even the sweepings with the wheat. Right? The Lord, who has sworn by himself, the pride of Jacob, I will never forget anything they have done. Right? So right there, he's saying, you make your money through exploitation. You have your wealth because you oppress poor people. You deny the gifts and the promise, the providence that Yahweh provides to all the Hebrews. And instead of reflecting that image in your covenant, you just go forth, right? So the idea here is that, as I share here in this point 3, is that there's a particular relationship that Yahweh is seeking, right? And that one should also reflect in one's fellow human beings. So one's regard for the poor in terms of Amos was a sign of one's closeness to Yahweh, because it meant that you were able to reflect, right, the gifts of Yahweh, right? That the goal of almost like it's just a kind of person you're supposed to be. And what the problem is, the national sin, is that the Hebrews are not the people, right, that have that unique, special, proximate relationship to Yahweh, and that is being poorly reflected in their behavior. So definitely a massive social justice piece. The other is the primacy of morality, right? Morality for Amos is not just being a member of the group within a covenantal community. It's superior to the community. In other words, it's about a relationship rather than some cultic duty. In fact, if you go to Amos 5, so let's flip over there. I love this one too. Give me a second here and I'll get over there with you. You flip over to Amos 5 and down to verses 21 through 24, right? He says here, I hate and I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship and offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never failing stream. Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings 40 years in the wilderness, people of Israel? And he just goes on. What he's saying here is, you can bring all the offerings, you can bring all the songs and the festivals and the celebrations, but it is absolutely meaningless, right? It's absolutely meaningless. It's hypocritical, which is a horrible charge amongst the prophets, right? Is that you say one thing, right? When you engage in those rituals, when you engage in those practices and you say those prayers, but your behavior is another thing. So he's really like amped up about that. And that chapter 5 really gives you a great example. Excuse me. And that anti-cultic theme is one that's definitely hammered. We're going to see a lot of that continued in some of the other prophetic books that we're going to look at down the road. Okay, so the other is the morality as a national history, right? The prophets, this is a big theme, and Amos really helps us in some of those passages we've already looked at. You can see this. Insisted that the day-to-day morality, the way that you behave. Now remember, morality is your behavior, what you eat, what you wear, who you marry, but it is also like how you know what the right thing to do is by other people. And for these prophets, right, that day-to-day ethic, that day-to-day morality is a decisive factor in the national history. There is no sort of individual go do your own thing. Your choices have an impact on everyone, even for generations to come. That's a really, really big piece for understanding the dynamic and ethic that's going on here. That again, the individual is still culpable for his or her choices, but that individual culpability also extends to a collective culpability. So that the covenant with Yahweh then places this sort of moral and religious obligation on Israel, and it really breaks down, right, in these obligations, which result in a correction. The greatest breach is idolatry, especially seen through the monarch, right? We're back at that whole monarchy thing again, right? But here's the evolution of that. It's not, the same one that we were introduced to in the period of the judges, or even as we saw it evolved in the period of the monarchy. Here in the prophetic literature, we've taken on this old idea of idolatry, right? But the fundamental problem always being is that don't get it twisted. All power, all authority belongs to God. Anyone that has it only has it by God. So the prophets extend to the last piece of this is that Israel's infidelity, that's a big word for them, will like the lack of, keeping their promises and being true to Yahweh alone, right, will include a lot of other moral failings such as lying and cheating and stealing, like we saw at the marketplace where they tip the scales. And so if you've ever seen, like, they hold their fingers on the scales and suggest that you're getting more grain or rice or wheat, right, than you are, and they overcharge you. And what's interesting here is just how commonplace the transgressions are. If you go to Amos 2 and read through verses 6 through 8, right, it's just like everybody's kind of just lost their mind and everybody's engaging in these behaviors, and it's just piling up. So, and that collective sin is a really important piece there. Finally, though, within all of that, we get the theme of hope. And you see this in Amos, right? Even as the prophet is delivering this doom and all the bad things that are about to happen because we cannot get our act together, right? One of the things that you see is that when you're reading through the literature, and pay attention to this and see if you can mark it in your text, is it's doom, everything's bad, the worst is going to happen, and then here's how the restoration or the hope is going to go. And what we start to see here is something called an eschatology. Now, I want to take a moment and pause and make a distinction for you here. A lot of people make a mistake about the difference between apocalyptic and eschatological. If you're using or talking about an eschatology, sorry, I'll get it right there, eschatology, then you're talking about the end times. This is sort of like, think in Avengers Endgame, how this is all going to potentially play out, right? Now, that's a really big piece in the prophetic material. Apocalyptic often is what refers to the inbreaking of heaven or the divine into the history or into the life of humanity. So that's a little different. You can have a text that's both apocalyptic and eschatological. You can have a text that's apocalyptic, and you can have a text that's eschatological. And I think that's often, you see them kind of mixed up. And that's why I think people get those terms mixed up. But remember this, eschatological means in game. It means in time. So how that's supposed to shape out. And that's part of what you see in these hope materials, the passages that follow, is how this is going to kind of wind itself out. So I would point you to taking a look then at chapter 5, verses 18 through 20, and then again, chapter 8, verses 9 through 12, to kind of see how that works. And then ask yourself, what's the heart of the transformation within the passage, right? Remember too that, when Amos is moving around, he's moving around at a time of peace and prosperity. And so the primary message of the book is one of restoration and reorientation as it sees the ethic fulfilling those kind of covenantal promises. So even as doom kind of is out there, and, for those that are not going to change their course, there always remains hope. So I would say, and you can do this on your own, is to go check out chapter 9 and chapters 13 through 15 and see if you can locate those moments of hope. In fact, I would go through and highlight them, because that might be a really great resource to go ahead and have done heading into the final exam. Okay, so that wraps us up with Amos. I tried to keep this kind of short and quick because I know this section is pretty long. We got one more lecture to go, and we're going to talk about the book of Hosea. So I'll see you in just a moment. Take a break, get a snack, and I'll see you in a few moments.